They called her the Blue-Eyed Butcher, a beautiful young mother, a quiet suburban home, and one of the most shocking murders Texas had ever seen. On a cold January night in 2003, Susan Wright tucked her 2 children into bed, then walked into her bedroom carrying a knife. Her husband, Jeff Wright, never walked out alive. Police say she tied him to the bed, wrists and ankles bound with rope, and stabbed him, not once, not 10 times, but 193 times. The story spread like wildfire. How could a woman, a mother, commit such a brutal, cold-blooded act? But Susan told a different story. She said Jeff had beaten her for years, that every bruise, every broken bone, every sleepless night pushed her closer to the edge. And that night, she finally snapped. Was it murder or was it survival? Prosecutors painted her as a master manipulator who killed for revenge and money. Her lawyers said she was a terrified woman trapped in an abusive marriage fighting for her life. And when the jury saw the bloody bed, the real bed brought into the courtroom, they didn't see a victim, they saw a monster. But behind those blue eyes was something no one could agree on: a cold-blooded killer or a woman pushed too far. Because when love turns to fear and fear turns to rage, there's no telling what a desperate heart might do. Stay until the end, because the truth behind the Blue-Eyed Butcher will make you question everything you think you know about self-defense and evil. Classification: murderer. Characteristics: parricide. Abuse. Number of victims: 1. Date of murder: January 13, 2003. Date of arrest: 11 days after, turned herself in to authorities. Date of birth: April 24, 1976. Victim profile: Jeff Wright, 34, her husband. Method of murder: stabbing with knife, 193 times. Location: Houston, Texas. Harris County. USA status: sentenced to 25 years in prison on March 4, 2004. Resentenced to 20 years in prison on November 20, 2010. Susan Lucille Wright. Born April 24, 1976. Is an American woman from Houston, Texas, who made headlines in 2003 for stabbing her husband Jeff Wright 193 times and then burying his body in their backyard. She was convicted of first-degree murder in 2004 and is currently serving a 20-year sentence at correctional facility in Gatesville, Texas, as of 2012. Early life. Susan Wright was born Susan Lucille Wright on April 24, 1976 in Houston, Texas. At the age of 18, she worked as a topless dancer at Gold Cup for 2 months. In 1997, while working as a restaurant waitress in Galveston, she met Jeff Wright, and they married in 1998, while she was 8.5 months pregnant with their first son, Bradley. A few years later, a son, Cody, was born. Wright claims that her husband began to abuse her during the first few years of their marriage. Crime. According to evidence presented by the prosecution on Monday, January 13, 2003, Susan Wright, 26, tied her husband Jeff Wright, 34, to their bed and stabbed him 193 times with 2 different knives. She then buried his body in their Houston backyard. She attempted to cover up the crime scene by painting the bedroom. The next day, Wright filed a domestic abuse report in order to get a restraining order against her husband intended to explain his absence. According to the evidence adduced during the 2010 punishment trial, it was shown that the prosecution's theory that Jeff was tied to the bed was not supported by the medical examiner who excavated the body. The medical examiner testified that Jeff had a significant amount of cocaine in his body the night he died, so much so that Jeff's body had not metabolized all the cocaine. The cocaine evidence supported the defense's assertion that Jeff was intoxicated the night of his death when he came home from a boxing class and punched his son. Jeff also had several knife wounds on his hands, forearms, back, and the backs of his legs, indicating defensive wounds inconsistent with being tied to a bed. On January the 18th, Wright asked her attorney, Neil Davis, to come to her home and admitted to stabbing her husband. Davis contacted the Harris County District Attorney's Office to inform them a body was buried under Susan Wright's house and that she had confessed to the crime. Wright turned herself in to authorities at the Harris County Courthouse on Friday, January 24th, and was arraigned on murder charges the following Monday. Trial. Only 13 months after her arraignment, Susan Wright's murder trial commenced on February 24, 2004. She had already pled not guilty to killing her husband by reason of self-defense. Wright's prosecutor and defense attorney had very different portrayals of her. Assistant District Attorney Kelly Siegler depicted Wright as a scheming wife who seduced her husband into bed, tied him up repeatedly, stabbed him, and then buried his body in their backyard, all in hopes of collecting a $200,000 life insurance policy. Wright's defense attorney, Neil Davis, claimed that his client had suffered years of physical and emotional abuse by her husband and killed him to protect herself and her 2 young children. At her trial, Susan Wright testified in her own defense. In her emotional testimony on the stand, Wright claimed, "I couldn't stop stabbing him. I couldn't stop. I knew as soon as I stopped he was going to get the knife back and he was going to kill me. I didn't want to die." She testified that on the night of the murder, Jeff Wright was on a cocaine binge and was violent, having allegedly beaten her. Wright once again persisted that she stabbed her husband in self-defense. Susan Wright's mother, among others, testified for the defense, claiming they witnessed Wright's bruises. Ada. Siegler was not impressed by Wright's statements. Siegler believed that Wright's tears were faked for the jury's benefit. While presenting their case, the prosecution presented an unusual demonstration by bringing the Wrights' actual bed into the courtroom. Using her co-counsel Siegler, depicted how she believed Susan Wright had tied her husband to their bed and stabbed him to death. During closing arguments, Siegler brought up to the jury how Wright had been a topless dancer and reiterated how she believed Wright's emotions were insincere. She contended that Susan Wright was a card-carrying, obvious, no doubt about it, caught red-handed, confirmed, documented liar, whose frequent shows of emotion during the trial were deliberate efforts to influence the jury. Wright's defense never strayed from their claims, however, that Wright had stabbed her husband to death in order to protect herself and her young children. Verdict. On March 3, 2004, after only 5.5 hours of deliberations, Wright's jury convicted her of murder. In sharp contrast to her emotional testimony during the trial, Wright showed little reaction to the guilty verdict. The following day came Wright's sentencing. Prosecutors were hoping for at least a 45-year sentence, while Wright's attorneys argued for probation for their client. In the end, the jury met in the middle, sentencing Wright to 25 years in prison. Appeal. In 2005, the 14th Court of Appeals of Texas in Houston upheld Susan Wright's conviction. In 2008, Wright reappealed. This time, a new witness, Misty McMichael, the wife of former NFL Super Bowl champion Steve McMichael and ex-fiancé of Jeff Wright, came forward to tell her story of how she endured abuse and violence during her 4-year relationship with Jeff Wright. In 2009, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals granted Wright a new sentencing hearing after determining that Wright's counsel rendered ineffective assistance during the punishment phase of trial in 2004. On November 20, 2010, Wright was resentenced to 20 years in prison, 5 years less than her original sentence. Barring another appeal, Wright will be eligible for parole on February 28, 2024, when she will be 48 years old. In popular culture, author Eric Francis wrote a book about the case entitled A Wife's Revenge in June 2005. Wright's murder trial had been nationally televised on Court TV. Wright's case was first profiled on Snapped in 2004, 48 Hours Mystery in 2005, on an E-special entitled Women Who Kill, and on the Deadly Women episode Lethal Love on ID in 2011. Wright's case is also the subject of the 2012 Lifetime original movie Blue-Eyed Butcher, starring Sarah Paxton and Lisa Edelstein. Susan Wright resentenced to 20 years in prison for husband's death, November 1, 2010. Houston. A jury on Tuesday resentenced Susan Wright to 20 years in prison, 5 years less than the original punishment she was given in her 2004 trial. Wright was convicted of murder in the now infamous stabbing death of her husband. Jeffrey Wright was stabbed 193 times and partially buried in a hole in the couple's backyard. Susan Wright was granted a new sentencing hearing after a judge ruled she didn't get adequate representation during the punishment phase of her original trial. The jury began deliberating Wright's fate Monday afternoon and came to a decision after 9 hours. In closing arguments, prosecutors portrayed Susan Wright as a murderer, while defense attorneys characterized her as a battered wife who acted out of sudden passion. When she killed her husband, Wright used neckties to bind him to their bed and then stabbed him with a kitchen knife from head to toe. His body was found partially buried in a backyard hole Jeffrey Wright had been digging for a fish pond. The family dog unearthed a portion of his corpse. "You don't stab someone 193 times for no reason," said defense attorney Tommy Lafon. "It's the result of years of pent-up frustration, anger, abuse and terror." Lafon said Wright's actions amounted to self-defense in a tortured marriage to a drug-addicted and abusive man. Prosecutors, however, said it was divorce by premeditated murder. They admitted that Jeffrey Wright was not the perfect husband and that he had a history of drug abuse. But they said Susan Wright began making claims of physical and emotional abuse at the hands of her husband only after he was dead. "This was a divorce by homicide. She was not a battered woman but a pissed-off wife," said Assistant District Attorney John Jordan. Prosecutors asked the jury to sentence Susan Wright to 45 years in prison. The defense asked for as little as 10 years probation. The jury gave her 20 years instead, with credit for time served. Justice is whatever a jury says it is, and this jury basically is saying what the first jury did was the right thing. And we have to accept that, said Assistant District Attorney John Jordan. Whether you believe she was domestically abused or not, more people got educated in reference to domestic abuse than could have possibly happened any other way, Defense Attorney Jonathan Munier said. Ron Wright Jr. defended his brother's reputation in the family's victim impact statement. "My brother was a kind and thoughtful man who loved life. He's not here to defend himself, but I am. Jeff's legacy will be his 2 children who my wife and I are honored to raise. As for Susan Wright, I've seen your tears, and I realize that over the last 7 years they are not tears for remorse, nor are they tears for what you've done to your 2 beautiful children. You left them parentless. What I've seen is that they're selfish tears, the fact that you have to go back to prison," Ron Wright said. He said the last words Jeff Wright spoke to his family were, "I love you, Mum." "The Wright family has been given a life sentence and I think you got off too easy," he added. Susan Wright apologized to her in-laws after sentencing. "I just want you to know that I'm sorry. Again, I'm sorry. I'm sorry he's not here. I'm sorry you don't have your son and your brother-in-law. And I'm sorry that the kids don't have their father. I'm sorry that he's not here," she said. While the final decision will rest with the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles, Wright could be eligible to be considered for parole in as little as 3 years. Texas vs. Wright wife stabs husband to death. April 12, 2005. Susan Wright claimed her husband was abusive, so abusive that she had no choice but to stab him approximately 200 times to defend herself. But prosecutors believed the attractive 27-year-old mother of 2 was a calculating murderer who convinced her husband to allow her to tie him to the bed as part of a sex game. Once she rendered him defenseless, they contended she got on top of him and inflicted at least 193 wounds with a hunting knife. Susan Wright admitted killing her 34-year-old husband Jeffrey Wright and burying his body outside their Houston home in a hole he had dug for a backyard fountain. But she hoped to convince a Harris County jury to find her not guilty of murder. In a trial that began on February 23, 2004, and gained national attention because of the dramatic courtroom reenactment of the crime, the defendant faced a maximum of life in prison if convicted of murder. The marriage. Jeffrey Wright was characterized by many as a charming, gregarious man who had no trouble meeting women. Friends described him as someone who always liked to have fun, sometimes indulging in drugs and visits to topless clubs. He met his future wife in 1997 on a double date. The following year, the two married when Susan was 8 months pregnant with their first child, a son they named Bradley. Friends say marriage seemed to agree with Jeffrey Wright, and that he appeared to be a proud father who enjoyed the stability of family life. Susan Wright stayed home to care for Bradley and the couple's second child daughter, Kaylee, while Jeffrey Wright worked as a sales representative for carpet and tile companies. But according to Susan Wright, things were not as happy as they appeared to outsiders. According to her, Jeffrey Wright became controlling around the time of Bradley's birth. He required her to keep him notified of her whereabouts at all times, she said, and only permitted her to leave the house for short periods of time. An unreported visit to the store or a few extra minutes at her parents' house would cause Jeff to accuse her of cheating, she claimed. Susan Wright claims she was expected to keep a perfect home, and that even a toy on the floor or dinner on the table a few minutes late would send her husband into a fit of rage. She maintained she was verbally abused, physically battered, and often raped by her husband. According to his wife, Jeffrey Wright's temper became more explosive when he used cocaine. Upon his death, the medical examiner found traces of the illegal drug in his system. Susan Wright also said women her husband was having affairs with would regularly call the house, and that she contracted herpes from him. But it wasn't until Jeffrey Wright began directing his anger toward his children, Susan Wright claimed that she decided to issue an ultimatum to her husband. The stabbing. On the evening of January 13, 2003, Jeffrey Wright came home from a boxing lesson. Susan Wright claims her husband appeared to be under the influence of drugs at the time. Later that evening, she said Bradley came to her crying, saying that his father had hit him. After putting the children to bed, Susan Wright approached her husband about seeking help for his anger and drug use, she said, and that if he refused, she would be forced to leave him. The ultimatum, according to Susan Wright, prompted a violent reaction. She claimed her husband pushed her to the floor, kicked her repeatedly in the stomach, then dragged her to the bed and raped her. Susan Wright claimed that after the sexual encounter was over, she was lying in bed with her eyes closed. She heard her husband say, "Die, bitch." When she opened her eyes, she claimed her husband was hovering over her with a knife. Driven by self-preservation and maternal instinct, she said the 5'5", 120-pound Susan Wright was able to push her 6'3", 220-pound husband aside and grab the knife from him. In the frenzied struggle, she stabbed the man again and again, fearing he would kill her if she stopped. When Bradley came to the door, she brought the boy back to bed, assuring him everything was all right, before she returned to her bedroom and continued to stab her husband. "I stabbed him in the head, and I stabbed him in the neck, and I stabbed him in the chest, and I stabbed him in the stomach, and I stabbed his leg for all the times he kicked me, and I stabbed his penis for all the times he made me have sex when I didn't want to," she later testified. In a fog. Susan Wright said she was in a fog the rest of the week. She deposited the body in the backyard in a shallow hole her husband once dug with plans to install a fountain. Occasionally, she would put more potting soil on it to weigh him down, because she was still fearful of him. She did not eat and got no sleep, instead sitting awake on the couch at night clutching the knife, expecting a furious Jeff to arrive home at any moment, she said. Claiming she knew he'd be especially angry over a mess in the bedroom, she purchased bleach and paint and began to clean up. She cut some of the blood-stained carpet up and somehow managed to take apart the bed frame, leaving it and the mattress in the yard. 5 days after the killing, Susan Wright told her mother what had happened. After the family contacted the prestigious Houston law firm, DeGuerin Dixon and Hennessy lawyer Neil Davis, had Susan Wright admitted to a mental health facility. On the evening of Jan the 18th, 2003, Davis went to the district attorney's office to report a dead body to prosecutors. He gave them the address but refused to reveal who his client was or how he was made aware of the corpse. That night, authorities proceeded to the home and found the partially buried body of Jeffrey Wright. The family dog had apparently unearthed the corpse and chewed off the left hand. Neckties were found tied around Jeffrey Wright's wrists, and one ankle was bound by a bathrobe sash. There was red candle wax on Wright's buttock thigh and genital area, apparently from candles found in the bedroom. A knife, described as a small hunting knife with a broken tip, was found in a flower pot on the patio. The tip of the knife was later located in skull of Jeff Wright. Police also found the bedframe box spring and bloody mattress partly disassembled and left in the backyard, as well as a haphazard cleanup job in the bedroom. They observed some ripped-out carpet clothing stained with bleach and a partially repainted wall. The medical examiner determined Wright had been stabbed at least 193 times from head to ankles. None of the injuries were deemed to have been fatal on their own. Prosecutors filed charges against Susan Wright, who subsequently turned herself in to authorities. The prosecution's case. Prosecutor Kelly Siegler conceded the Wright marriage was unhealthy and destined to end badly, but argued Susan Wright was lying about the severe abuse she described. Such abuse, Siegler contended, would have caused grave injuries such as a concussion or broken bones, but that the defendant never received medical treatment for such injuries, nor had any friends or family observed them. In fact, a throng of prosecution witnesses described Jeff Wright as a kind and gentle husband, and testified he and his wife acted lovingly toward each other. The prosecution points to a $200,000 life insurance policy as a motive. A co-worker of Jeffrey Wright would testify to overhearing a phone conversation in which Susan berated her husband for filling out the paperwork for the life insurance, incorrectly holding up the process. Siegler called the defendant's story that a cocaine-fueled Jeff straddled her with the knife ridiculous. It would have been impossible for the petite defendant, especially after a brutal beating and rape that she described, to overtake her much larger husband, because the neckties and bathrobe sash found on Jeffrey Wright's arms and leg appeared to have been cut. Siegler argued it was clear that he was tied up at the time of the stabbing. She argued that the candle wax found on his body was used as part of a sex game, which ended with Susan Wright straddling her husband and stabbing him repeatedly. The number of stab wounds took much time and energy to inflict, which the prosecution claimed showed the defendant's calculating state of mind. Furthermore, wounds on the victim's genitals were superficial nicks and slashes, which Siegler said Susan Wright inflicted coolly and deliberately. Siegler sneered at the defense's claim that Wright had a break with reality after the killing. The bleach and paint were purchased merely to cover up a crime. She said not because of a fear her dead husband would be angered by a mess. In what Siegler sarcastically referred to as moments of clarity in the week of fog, Wright took her husband's name off the outgoing message on their answering machine and cleaned out their joint checking account. Even more deviously, though, according to prosecutors, Wright began to manipulate the people around her with lies to cover up what she had done by playing the role of the abused, frightened wife. The day after the stabbing, she went to law enforcement officials and pressed charges against Jeff for hitting her and Bradley. Photographs were taken of her injuries, cuts and bruises she in fact sustained, contended Siegler, while stabbing her husband to death. Wright then asked her neighbors to call police if they saw her husband and told her family her husband had taken off in anger after beating her. Finally, in a move that Kelly Siegler said shows exactly what Susan Wright is capable of, she called Kay Wright Jeff's mother and repeated the story about Jeff storming off after a violent tantrum. She also told Kay Wright that her son had begun severely abusing cocaine, was behind on their bills, had tried to borrow thousands of dollars to pay for his drug habit, and wasn't going to work very often. Siegler argued Susan Wright only went to her family and admitted stabbing her husband when she realized she was in over her head and needed to contact a high-priced defense firm. Susan Wright was a good actress who manipulated those around her with her looks and demeanor, Siegler said, and was able to turn tears on and off like a faucet. Courtroom bedroom. In an attempt to recreate their theory of the crime for the jury, prosecutors brought the bed, including the blood-stained mattress, into court and had it assembled during a recess. The defendant broke down at the sight of the bed and continued to cry throughout the demonstration. With the jury present, Siegler established that she herself was the approximate size of Susan Wright, and that a male colleague of hers, Paul Doyle, is the height and weight of the victim. Siegler then asked the witness lead investigator, Mark Reynolds, to tie her colleague to the bed with neckties and bathrobe sashes in the manner indicated by the ligatures found on Jeffrey Wright's wrists and leg. After Reynolds did so, Siegler climbed onto the bed and straddled her colleague, knife in hand, and began a laborious demonstration of how the wounds to Jeff Wright's body likely were inflicted. Judge Jim Wallace, however, sustained an objection by the defense when Siegler attempted to act out Susan Wright's own scenario by lying on the bed with Doyle on top of her to show that Wright couldn't have wrestled free of her husband in that type of situation. While defense attorneys said such courtroom theatrics should be confined to bad TV movies, Siegler maintained the dramatic demonstration was the only way to drive home to jurors exactly how defenseless Jeff Wright was, regardless of whether he was a perfect husband. The defense's case. Few of us can imagine the dynamics of the master-slave relationship that developed between Jeffrey Wright and his wife, maintained defense lawyer Neil Davis. Susan Wright was in constant fear of everything from the kids acting up to dinner being late, he said. Anything short of perfection was unacceptable and would result in violent tantrums by her husband. To counteract testimony by prosecution witnesses that painted Jeffrey Wright as a non-violent, loving husband, the defense had their own witnesses who portrayed him as someone who often abused his dogs. Jeffrey Wright, the defense pointed out, was even convicted of assaulting a stripper with whom he was having an affair. Defense attorneys even received a call from one of Jeff's party buddies before trial who agreed to testify to the Jeff he knew a man who often lost all control of his temper and flew into violent rages, many of them drug-fueled. Those close to Susan Wright said they long suspected she was being physically abused by her husband. Her sister claimed to have been aware of it, and a neighbor says she knew about the fear Susan had of Jeff. Even the defendant's hairdresser said she observed odd bruises she assumed were the result of domestic abuse. Davis said Jeffrey Wright was a man concerned with appearances who was careful when abusing his wife, that few people saw the injuries she sustained. The defense also maintained that police ignored key evidence in the home, including holes in the wall that had been sloppily patched from incidents in which Jeff Wright allegedly threw punches at his wife and missed. Also ignored, Davis said, was a shattered bathroom door frame that was broken when Jeffrey Wright apparently slammed the door on his wife's arm repeatedly until the wood cracked. The constant abuse had obviously affected the mental and emotional state of Susan Wright for a long time, said Davis. On the night of the killing, she was pushed over the edge and experienced a complete break with reality. Wright's irrational behavior during her week of fog is evidence of this, say her attorneys. She did a horrendously poor job of cleaning up the scene, hardly acting the part of a cold-blooded, methodical murderess. In fact, Wright showed signs of complete detachment from reality, even when the lawyers met her almost a week after the stabbing, and was still terrified of her then-dead husband. The defense also maintained physical evidence proves that Susan Wright's account of the stabbing is true. Jeffrey Wright had clear defensive wounds on his hands, say the attorneys, and one does not get defensive wounds unless one is free to fight. There were no bruises on Jeffrey Wright's wrists and ankles. There would have been if he'd been securely tied and struggling. Police also fumbled some key pieces of evidence, according to the defense. The bed frame, for example, was never checked for fibers from the neckties and bathrobe sashes that allegedly were tied to it. The fingernail clippings from Jeff Wright's hands, which surely would have shown that he scratched Susan during a struggle that night, were not properly preserved and became moldy and unusable as they sat in an evidence room. As for the life insurance policy, Neil Davis said that as with so much else in Jeffrey Wright's life, this too was kept from his client. In fact, not only did she not know about the policy on him, but she was concerned because he'd wanted to take one out on her. Even if the jury did find Wright guilty of murder, argued her lawyers, Wright was a loving mother of 2 small children with no history of crime or violence and should receive only probation. The verdict. On March 2, 2004, after approximately 5 hours of deliberation, the jury of 7 men and 5 women found Susan Wright guilty of murder. 2 days later, the same panel rejected the defense claim that the defendant was under the influence of sudden passion. Wright appeared stunned at the sentence and began sobbing as it was read. She mouthed, "I'm so sorry," to her family as she was led out of the courtroom. She was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Right or wrong? Was Susan Wright pushed to the edge when she killed her husband July 21, 2004? It's hard to say what's most horrifying. How Jeff Wright was killed, who killed him, or why she says she did it. The woman accused of committing murder is Jeff's wife, Susan, 27, a stay-at-home mother of 2. "I did not want to die," says Susan, who now faces life in prison. "This was a brutal, terrifying, sadistic relationship that spanned years," says Susan's attorney, Neil Davis. Susan Wright stabbed her husband 193 times. And Davis says he believes that Susan's husband, Jeff Wright, triggered the attack that ended his life. I hate to say it, but some people just deserve killing. That's how a lot of Texas lawyers interpret self-defense. But what makes this case different is that Susan and her lawyers are saying it on the record. "She had to kill or be killed," says Davis. Correspondent Richard Schlesinger reported on this mystery last spring. It wasn't that long ago that Jeff, a successful carpet salesman, was smothering Susan with kindness. Susan was a waitress when they first met in 1997 on the beach in Galveston, Texas. He would call 2 or 3 times a day, recalls Susan. "When he was around me, he would bring flowers and little gifts and stuff. He was very sweet." A year later, they married, and Susan was already 8 months pregnant with their son, Bradley. He wanted a house. He wanted a family and a dog, and it just seemed great, says Susan, who says things were good until Bradley was born. Then everything changed, says Susan, who claims that Jeff became controlling and demanding. "Everything inside the house was my job, including Bradley. Everything I needed to make everything perfect. Bradley needed to be clean and quiet all the time. The house had to be spotless, all the laundry done, all the cooking. It got to be pretty hard." Susan says Jeff would yell at her the few times she complained, and says this was a side that he never showed her while they were dating. It wasn't long, she says, before Jeff started beating her. It happened, she says, after Jeff had smoked pot. "He threw me back against the wall and he grabbed me by my arms and shook me up against the wall and then punched me in the chest," says Susan. "He made me feel like it was my fault because I didn't have a right to tell him not to touch his son." Susan's sister Cindy, a psychologist with a PhD, tried to intervene once and moved her and the children to her parents' house, but they only stayed there overnight. According to Susan, a moving van showed up the next morning and took me back home. Why did she go back just a day after she was beaten? "I didn't have a choice," says Susan. "I was afraid of him, but as much as I was afraid of him, I loved him, and I wanted to be good enough to where things work." But things got worse and there were more drugs and more abuse. Jeff's father, Ron Wright, says he knew his son had a drug problem, but that it was under control. He also says that the claims of physical abuse were all a lie. "She didn't have any symptoms of being an abused woman," says Ron Wright. "We don't abuse women. We love our women." But Susan's sister Cindy says she saw Susan's bruises. "I've seen bruises all over her arms and legs. I've seen her on 2 different occasions with a black eye." Susan's friend Jamie Dar Hall also remembers that black eye. "I think she was being abused quite often." Susan, however, never reported any abuse to police while Jeff was alive. She even had a second child with him and says the abuse got worse after their daughter Kaylee was born. She described herself as the wrapping on the package, that it was her job to make things look beautiful on the outside so that no one would wonder what it's like on the inside, says Cindy. But inside the Wright house, Susan says there was nothing but emotional and physical pain until Jan 13, 2003, the last day of Jeff Wright's life. Susan says Jeff had come back from a boxing lesson and he had been using drugs. He started to spar with Bradley, who didn't want to fight back. She says he started hitting Bradley and stormed off when his son started crying. Susan says she comforted Bradley and put him and Kaylee one to bed. Then she says she confronted Jeff for the first time about his problems with drugs and violence. I couldn't go on, and I was afraid of him. I knew if I left him, he would kill me. But I had to ask him to get help. And that was my big mistake, says Susan. I wasn't supposed to give him ultimatums. I wasn't supposed to tell him what to do. She says Jeff exploded, pushed her down on the bed and raped her. A moment later, he was back this time holding a knife over her head. I didn't want to die, she says. Even though Jeff was almost a foot taller than Susan and 100 pounds heavier, Susan says she overpowered him by kneeing him in the groin. She then grabbed the knife and started repeatedly stabbing him 193 times. I was terrified because he was going to kill me, says Susan. I knew the second that I stopped, he was going to get the knife back and then I was going to be the one that would be dead. After the attack, Susan says she went into a state of shock that lasted a week. Believe it or not, she says she thought Jeff was still alive. I was terrified. I was panicked, recalls Susan. I thought that as soon as he woke up that he was going to be mad and I had to get him out of the house. She buried Jeff's body in a shallow hole on the patio next to the bedroom. It was a hole that Jeff had dug as part of a home improvement project. I was so scared. I thought if I put him there and put some dirt on him that he would have a hard time getting out to come after me, says Susan. I sat on the sofa waiting for him to get up, and I watched all night waiting for him to come back. That week, Susan cut away the bloody carpet, dragged the blood-soaked mattress to the backyard, painted the blood-spattered walls and bought more dirt to pile on top of her husband's body. But she says she wasn't trying to cover up a crime. The house always had to be perfect, and everything had to be in order and straight and neat, and it wasn't. Susan told her friend Jamie that she and Jeff had a terrible fight, and he had stormed off. Her friend advised her to call the police, file a report, and change the locks. 2 days after she killed her husband, Susan went to the police to get an order of protection against him. She was very believable to me. Very believable. She had bruises on her arms that were consistent as to what she said happened, says Deputy Scott Hall, who photographed cuts on her hands that Susan said she got when Jeff attacked her. I had thought she'd been assaulted and that she had a legitimate report she was making. I had no reason to suspect anything else. 5 days after killing her husband, Susan says she had a horrible feeling that something was wrong and talked to her mother about it. She asked if I killed him, and I just put my head down, says Susan. At this point, nothing was making sense to me. Susan's mother knew her daughter needed a lot of help, so she contacted attorney Neil Davis. She appeared to be completely out of touch with reality, says Davis, because she appeared to think that her husband was still alive. Davis then checked Susan into a psychiatric ward and contacted the district attorney's office. All I did was write down an address on the back of my business card, says Davis. I said, there's a dead body at this address and I can't say anything else. Part 2. Right or Wrong. Was Susan Wright hiding a terrible secret? July 21st, 2004. The family of Jeff Wright says they never saw it coming. I consider her some type of animal, says Jeff's father, Ron Wright. Harris County Prosecutor Kelly Siegler says Susan Wright didn't have to kill Jeff and that there was a simpler solution: divorce. She plays the martyr very well, says Siegler. There's nothing we could find that shows she's telling the truth. As the trial begins, Siegler knows that the jury could easily sympathize with Susan. Mitigating factor from day one was she's a pretty female, says Siegler. You have to make them see it and feel it and relive what happened to the victim. That's how you make a jury understand how horrible a crime it is. Siegler reassembled the blood-soaked bed on which Jeff was killed, in the middle of the courtroom right in front of Susan Jeff's family and the jury. The jury needed to appreciate how completely defenseless Jeffrey was when she did it, says Siegler. Siegler also demonstrated what police believe happened that night and said it has nothing to do with self-defense. Jeff's body was found with neckties knotted around his wrists and a terry cloth belt around one leg. Siegler told the jury they were used to lash Jeff to the bed, so if the defendant were to get up on top of Jeffrey Wright, something like this, and straddle him. Siegler said Susan seduced Jeff into agreeing to be tied to the bed with the promise of unusual sex. She seduces him. She gets him nude. She gets herself nude, says Siegler. She ties him up like they had many times before, lights the candles to make him really think this is going to be a great romantic night. Siegler says Susan stabbed Jeff after she tied him to the bed. And she says that before Susan killed Jeff, she tortured him, making superficial slices to his penis. That's a direct challenge to Susan's claim that she killed her husband in self-defense when he came at her with a knife. But Siegler thinks she can prove how the crime happened. Medical examiner Dwayne Wolfe confirms that Jeff had used drugs before he was killed. But more importantly, he says that Jeff was tied down while he was stabbed. Out of his 193 stab wounds, almost all of them were on the front of the body, said Wolfe. And if a person is not restrained, they'd be moving. I'd be moving. I would have stab wounds predominantly on my back as I'm heading toward the door. Siegler also has to deal with Susan's claims of abuse. And friends, customers and neighbors all said that Jeff seemed to love Susan and that they never witnessed any signs of abuse. But Susan's mother, Sue Wright, and her friend Jamie Dar Hall testified that they saw bruises on her body. Jeff also had a checkered past, had pleaded guilty to drug possession, and had assaulted a former girlfriend. And Susan had to explain why at 18 she was a topless dancer for 2 months. After the prosecution rests, the stage is set for the most dramatic day of the trial. Accused killer Susan must now take the stand and tell her side of the story, as the star witness at her own trial. It's up to her to convince the jurors that she was a battered wife and that her husband attacked her with a knife. To save her life, she said she had to stab him 193 times. In his head, and in his chest, and in his neck, and in his stomach, and in his leg. For when he kicked me, says Susan, I stabbed him in his penis for all the times that he made me have sex, and I didn't want to, and I couldn't stop. Next, Susan reveals a detail that only her defense team has heard before. She says she stopped stabbing Jeff when she heard a knock at the bedroom door. She says she was covered with Jeff's blood, put on a robe, hid the knife, and opened the door. Standing there, she says, was their 4-year-old son, Bradley. She's known all along. He heard it, and she never told anyone about it, says Siegler. And my God, what did he see? Susan's lawyer, Neil Davis, however, says this admission proves his client is telling the truth about what happened and why. Who would want to get up there and admit that their child knocked on the door unless it was true? Who would want to get up there and admit they used 2 knives instead of 1 unless it was true? But Susan also has to explain how ties found on Jeff's hands and leg got there. She says she tied his body to a dolly she used to push him outside so that he'd stay on. I kept thinking that he was going to get up. Perhaps the most issue I felt even more difficult than the 193 stab wounds trying to explain to a jury how Susan thought her husband was still alive, even though she just stabbed him 200 times and put him in a hole he dug in his backyard, says Davis. After 5 hours of questioning, Siegler gets her chance. She shifts the jury's attention from Susan the mother to her past as a stripper. She also hammers Susan on whether or not she tied Jeff up before stabbing him. And when you stabbed him the 56th time, or the 89th time, or the 158th time, was your arm getting tired? Asks Siegler. But Susan never wavers. After 8 days of testimony, Siegler has the last word. What you're left with is the word of Susan Lucille Wright, the word of a card-carrying, obvious, no doubt about it, caught red-handed, confirmed, documented liar. Now it's up to the jury to decide. And just as Siegler had feared, jurors have trouble seeing Susan as a murderer. But it's hard for them to forget the blood-soaked bed, and they had it reassembled when they deliberated. 2 days later, they reached a verdict guilty. It's a shock, says Susan. I just assumed that because what I was saying was the truth, that everyone would believe it. I had no idea how anyone could look in her eyes and listen to her and not believe her, says Susan's sister Cindy Stewart. But it turns out that the jury did do just that. And jurors say her story just wasn't believable. What was most troubling to jurors was Susan's motive. They say they couldn't say what happened, what drove her to the edge. But there were hints during the trial about what might have motivated Susan to murder her husband, including allegations that Susan saw her own mother abused, a charge her mother has denied. After the trial, Susan's sister Cindy says she won't see her parents again because I love my sister. She claims their father sometimes beat her and her mother, and Susan saw it, but no one ever called the police. And Cindy says that explains what happened the night Susan killed her husband. I understood why she stabbed him so many times. She said she stabbed Jeff for all the times he punched her in the chest, and she stabbed him in the penis for all the times he raped her in the middle of the night, and she stabbed Jeff for my father. Just as Susan's mother did on the stand, both of her parents denied Cindy's accusations in an off-camera conversation with 48 Hours. They said they've been good and loving parents and that Cindy's charges have no merit or foundation at all. Once the jurors convicted Susan, they have to decide her punishment, which could be anything from probation to life. In the end, the jurors give Susan 25 years. Does Susan regret killing Jeff? There are days that I miss him, but like I said that night, he was going to live or I was. Susan's lawyers plan to appeal her conviction, arguing that Siegler prejudiced the jury with her bloody bed reenactment. Susan has not seen her children, Bradley, 5 and 2-year-old Kaylee, since her trial. They are now living with Jeff's brother. Both the Wright family and Susan's sister want custody. Since 48 Hours first reported on this mystery last April, a court date has been set on the issue with a hearing scheduled for next week. In 2004, a jury found Susan Wright guilty of murder. They didn't see a battered wife. They saw a woman who stabbed her husband nearly 200 times and buried him in the backyard. Her punishment, 25 years in prison. But the story didn't end there. Years later, new lawyers argued she wasn't a monster, she was a survivor. That the court never understood the years of terror, the bruises, the fear. And slowly, the world began to listen. In 2020, after 16 years behind bars, Susan Wright walked out of prison, older, quieter, free. When reporters asked if she regretted it, she only said, "I just wanted the violence to stop." To this day, people still argue. Was she a calculating killer who planned her husband's death, or a desperate woman who finally fought back? Maybe the truth lives somewhere between fear and fury. Maybe love and hate are just two sides of the same knife. Because when pain builds long enough and no one believes your screams, sometimes the only voice left is the one that cuts back. Subscribe for more true crime stories where love and death share the same bed.